So let's dive into Pro Q4. I'm gonna show you all the new features and push it to its limits so we can answer the question, is it worth the money? If you have the older version, it's like $62 to upgrade. And if you don't, then I think it's $179 for the full version. And I looked back at my old emails and I saw that I've been using FabFilter's EQ since 2015, which is almost 10 years now. And this is kind of ironic timing because literally just last week, I posted a video about how I think most plugins are a waste of money, but I did say there are a few obvious exceptions, and FabFilter's EQ is definitely one of them. I mean, I've used the EQ on every single mix, which is almost 3,000 mixes now for the past 10 years. And this video isn't sponsored at all. I just want to give you an honest review of this plugin and show you what it can do. So as you can see, it has the same overall user interface as before, which I think is great. I think it's one of the best looking plugins out there. But let's get into all the new features. Like I want to talk about the EQ draw, the all pass filter, the tone options, the instance view, and I'll save my favorite, the dynamic resonance suppression, for last. So now when you pull up the EQ, you can quickly draw in a curve to get a basic shape that you want. And then obviously you can quickly undo that if you don't like it. I find this feature is gonna be useful for saving a little bit of time for like broad EQ moves, but you can't get too precise with it. Like it doesn't want you to get too precise. It's not really for that. It's not really for making like narrow cuts in your EQ. It's more for like a general low cut filter and like some broad moves just to save you a little time. There are a couple EQs that already do this, one called Spline EQ and one from Melda Production. I definitely think it's a nice to have feature. I don't know if I'll be using it all the time, but it's definitely nice to have. Now, another cool feature that I don't think is a must have, but it's still pretty cool, is that now instead of just fixed slopes right here, you can actually dynamically change the slope. So you can get numbers in between the fixed slope. I mean, that'll help you be more precise if you're into sound design or you need to do something really specific. But I think for most people, that feature doesn't really matter that much. I mean, how many times have you opened up an EQ and really said, man, I really wish this band could have a slope between 24 decibels an octave and 30 decibels an octave. It's just not that big of a difference, but still, it's a nice feature to have. Now, another new option is when you go into the band types, now there's an all-pass filter. And an all-pass filter doesn't actually change the tone or frequency response of a sound, but it does change the phase of the sound, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's take this kick drum that's mixed with this bass. So looking at this oscilloscope over here, you can tell that the kick and bass are out of phase with each other, and there's phase cancellation going on because there's a huge dip between the kick and that sub bass. But if I add Pro Q4 to the bass, and then I add an all-pass filter to it, then I can actually adjust this all-pass filter, and you can see how the phase of the bass is changing as I adjust that. And actually now they're in phase. There's a nice like sausage looking waveform between the kick and the bass. So now they're mixed together well. And there are some more technical things you can do with an all-pass filter too. Like let's take that bass sound and send it to a send track. So now I'm running this bass in parallel. I'll turn that up and then I'll open Pro Q4 on that send track. So the left side is the send track and the right side is just the master output so you can see what's happening. So on this send track, I'm gonna add an all-pass filter, and then what I'm gonna do is flip the phase of it. So this just becomes a band pass filter when I do that, and I can actually like accentuate certain frequencies in the bass now using the all pass filter. So some of this stuff is even over my head, but you can get pretty technical and use some advanced mixing techniques with an all pass filter. But now let's get into my favorite features. So anytime you open up this EQ, now you can click on the name of the channel at the bottom, and then it'll bring up all the different instances of this EQ in your whole project, which is a super cool mixing tool. If you have a ton of EQs in your project, you can search for the track and it'll come up with whatever you search for. And then you can change the size of everything. Like if I want to see all the EQs at the same time, I can do that. I can turn this button off if I don't want it to automatically enlarge whenever my mouse goes over one of them. Or if you like that, you can turn it on. But let me show you how I would actually use this. So what I would do is I would probably turn this off. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go through and find my base layers and pin them. So I'll pin that base layer, pin this base layer. Where are the other bases here? Here's a base layer, here's a base layer. And then by clicking this button here, it moves all those base layers to the top. So I'm only looking at those pinned tracks now. And now I can see how all my base layers are interacting with each other. So yes, now you can go into each of these layers and adjust the EQ and add new bands and do whatever you want to multiple EQs at once, which is gonna be a huge time saver. And there's even an undo button over here so I can undo those changes I just made. And in this case, if I'm mixing in some bass layers, what I would do is go to the main bass layer and hit this collision reference button, and then it highlights in red where the problem frequencies are in the other layers and how they're interacting with that main layer. So I can know to cut those frequencies out, or I just know to look at those more carefully. And if you want to get a more detailed view of any of the layers, just click this button right here. You can even use the EQ draw feature right here. You can change the range so you can see more or less of these changes. I like to keep it on 12 if I'm just doing little changes. And then you can also copy this EQ setting. Then I'm going to go up to this band, this layer, and I'll paste it. That's pretty crazy. I feel like that's a time saver. I'll probably end up using this view on most mixes just so I get a high level picture of how my layers are interacting with each other. But now let's talk about my favorite new feature, which is spectral EQ or dynamic resonance suppression or whatever you want to call it. So let's take this guitar sound and let's say I wanted to turn down some harsh frequencies up here. So I'm going to change the EQ to this type of bell curve. And I'm just gonna set it in this area and I'll turn on the dynamic EQ, which was in the last version of this plugin. But now I can click this spectral EQ button and this turns it into more of a soothe-like dynamic resonance suppressor. And all that means is it just finds harsh frequencies that are poking out and it turns them down. So if you leave the threshold at the top, it makes the threshold automatic. And if you wanna set it yourself, you can turn it down. And you can change the range down here. So now it's really turning down those harsh frequencies. And with this button, you can control the density. So if you want a little bit of a smoother reduction, you can turn it to the left. And if you want it to be sharper and narrower, you can turn it to the right. And my favorite thing they've added here is actually the attack and release knobs, which they didn't have before. And that's super helpful for mixing. So I'm gonna turn the attack down all the way so I can catch these resonances immediately when they come up. And I'll turn the release down a good amount too. So that resonance suppression pops right up after those harsh frequencies are done playing. So now I wanna do the ultimate test and show you the reason that I'm most excited for this plugin, and that's because of vocal mixing.
Wouldn't change a thing even if I could.
So I have 4 different plugins controlling the tone of this vocal. I have Soothe controlling the low mids, and then another instance controlling the highs, and then I have a multiband compressor that's turning up the high end and adding some de-essing, and then I have a normal EQ with a low cut filter, and here's what that all sounds like.
Wouldn't change a thing even if I could.
So my big question here was, could I replace this complicated signal chain with one plugin? And the answer is yes.
Wouldn't change a thing even if I could.
So if I just loop this for a minute here, you can see with this band, I'm using the dynamic resonance suppression. So that's doing like what Soothe does and controlling the lows and the low mids. And then I'm also using dynamic resonance suppression up here to control the high end a little bit. Actually, I think that's this band. And that's controlling the high end a little bit. And then I do like to de-ess with the multiband compressor. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm just using the normal dynamic EQ here, and I'm turning up the high end, and then it's turning down any sibilance that comes up too loud in the high end. So that's acting like a de-esser. And then I'm doing the same thing in this region right here. So basically I'm doing the work of like 4 different plugins in one here. And another thing I can add to this is I can change the EQ mode down here and make it subtle or warm. And let's take a look at exactly what those modes do. So this plugin called Plugin Doctor allows me to see what's going on behind the scenes in this EQ. So you can see when I move a band around, that's exactly what happens in the frequency response. So when I'm in clean mode, the frequency response is totally flat. But when I change it to warm, now you can see there's a little boost from like 50 hertz to 200 hertz, a little dip around 1000 hertz, and then the highs are slightly brighter. So it's gonna change the tone a little bit. Now, if I go back in and change it to subtle mode, you can see that doesn't change the frequency response really. It just added a little high cut filter up here. But now let's go back to clean and go to the harmonic analysis tab. So what this does is play a clean sine wave, and you can see how that sine wave reacts to the plugin basically. So there's a little noise being added in this plugin, and that's normal. This noise is at like negative 185 decibels. You could never hear that, it's too low. Like that'll never be a factor in your mixes. Now let's change this to subtle mode. And you can see a little bit more noise is added, but it might smooth out your sound a little bit. And if we change it down to warm mode, you can see saturation is actually added because now we don't just have a sine wave at 100 hertz, we have a harmonic at 200 hertz. So it's really subtle saturation, but just know if you add this warm mode on your sound, it's gonna add really subtle harmonics to your sound, and it's gonna also change the tone a little bit. So let's see how that sounds on this vocal. Let's just do an A-B comparison test. So I'll play each of the 3 modes back to back to back. They're gonna be really subtle differences, but let me know if you can hear the difference.
Wouldn't change a thing even if I could. Wouldn't change a thing even if I could. Wouldn't change a thing even if I could.
So after all of that, we can finally answer the question, is this worth the hype? Is it worth the money? And I really think it is. I mean, if you're remotely serious about producing music, I think this is gonna be a really useful tool for you. But don't forget, fancy plugins don't make your music better. Learning more about songwriting and production makes your music better. So thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you next time. Peace.